Hello and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. With over 20,000 downloads since our launch, we're thrilled to present Season 5 of in-depth discussions on business, global affairs and news across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. Thank you for your continued support and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to our British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast. I'm Daisy, I'm the chair of the Tech Committee, and joining me today is another Tech Committee member, Sheena Jacob. She's partner at the global law firm CMS, and today we're discussing the key changes to the Singapore Cybersecurity Act. These changes are aimed at strengthening Singapore's national cybersecurity posture. They expand regulatory scope and enforcement powers. With cyber threats rapidly evolving, these updates are critical for Singapore to keep pace with technological changes and emerging risks. As a cybersecurity law expert, Sheena will provide us with an overview on the key amendments and what they mean for businesses operating in Singapore. Hi Sheena, good to see you. So here we're talking today about the Cybersecurity Act and the amendments that have come through this year. So I was thinking to just get us started, why don't you give us an overview of the original 2018 Act and then just bring in kind of the key changes that have come in this year.
Sure, happy to do that. So the original Cybersecurity Act was passed in 2018 and it really had a few key objectives. And firstly was to set up the Cybersecurity Agency, which was then able to drive cybersecurity compliance and strategy. And it also created the concept of a critical information infrastructure provider, and to ensure that companies that fell within this category would have reporting requirements, would need to meet certain standards, as they were really quite important to Singapore's infrastructure, national security, defense, etc.
Okay, so just give us, just for everyone, a few examples of who a CII would be.
Sure. So CII would be, for example, an energy provider like Singapore Power, a telecoms provider such as StarHub or Singtel, or, for example, financial services, a bank such as DBS. So all of these are information infrastructure providers are really quite important. Also includes Changi Airport, SMRT. So, sort of a lot of these services that we all use every day.
Yeah, the backbone of our lives, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's really important that these companies are meeting those minimum standards. Otherwise, as we've seen in other countries, when they get attacked, you could have hospitals, for example, that are not operating. Yeah. So that was another sort of key pillar of the original law. And then there was an additional objective, which was to regulate not just the CIIs, but also cybersecurity vendors or providers who, were providing services like penetration testing, as well as managed SOC monitoring services. And so these are very important to maintaining security, but it was also important that these vendors were themselves being regulated. And so in 2022, shortly after the Act was introduced, a licensing framework was developed. And so now any company that wants to provide these services in Singapore has to be registered and obtain a license from the Cybersecurity Agency. So that was the essential main objectives of the original Act that was passed in 2018.
Great. And then the amendments that have happened this year, which we'll obviously go into more detail, but if you can just give us a high level on what those amendments mean.
Sure. So I think just maybe some context for that, because 2018 is some years ago, 6 years ago.
Well, in the digital space, light years ago. So yeah.
And it's pre-pandemic, and so much happened during the pandemic. The acceleration of digital services, the adoption of technology was really rapidly accelerated, I think, by the pandemic. And so we've seen, much greater demand and adoption of digital services across all these sectors. And so I think there was a recognition that there's so much more being provided in the form of digital services that we need to make sure that it is regulated. At the same time, on the flip side, we've also had a huge increase in cyber attacks from malicious actors. Again, that was sort of during the pandemic. We saw a lot of that happening, and that has actually sort of added to the need to then look at, is this infrastructure safe? Are companies paying enough attention to security given the amount of data that they now have to take care of? And so I think the government felt that it was time to look at what else needed to be done. And so they were really focused on a few things. I would say that the first thing was, when we saw with the SolarWinds attack, it wasn't just the company's own systems that were attacked, it was actually third-party systems in their supply chain. And I think there is a recognition from the Singapore government that it is important for these CII service providers to also ensure that third-party systems that they are using are also going to be compliant, and they also need to meet reporting obligations in relation to those third-party systems. So that's one of the big changes that we are seeing under this new act. Another, I think, change that we are seeing is that there are these new regulated different classes of what I call entities, I suppose, and I can talk about them a little bit more in detail later, but owners of systems of temporary cybersecurity concerns, STCC, entities of special cybersecurity interests, which is ESCI, and foundational digital infrastructure service providers. So all of those are now new entities that are going to be regulated under this new law. And I think the last sort of amendment was to ensure that some parts of the new law will also apply to virtual computer systems, which we know are widely being used, whereas I think in the original act it was only applicable to actual physical systems. So these are quite important amendments, and they are now, the law has been passed, although it has not yet come into effect, and it will do so as soon as there is presidential assent.
Yeah. But getting prepared now, understanding it now, for companies, that you have to use that time wisely, don't you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think there is time now to make sure to look at this law and figure out what
you need to do. Yeah. And that supply chain element, because you talk about CIIs and we think, okay, this is only for the infrastructure bodies that need to consider it, but because of that supply chain element, actually it can start impacting really quite small companies that are just providing certain services into these organizations. So why don't we take that one to start with?
Okay.
So let's talk about why don't we break it down in terms of, okay, so what does the CII, what are they looking for in terms of when they're looking into their supply chain, and what are the impacts and the responsibilities and the challenges that they are dealing with, and we can glean from that then what it means for if we're a supplier into these large organizations.
So I think there are a few takeaways from that. I think the first thing, which is I think quite interesting, is that this would apply even to companies who may be located offshore. So a company in the UK, British company, for example, providing a system, cloud-based system to a CII in Singapore would then find itself, involved in this new regulation. The second thing I would say is that the regulation it doesn't directly regulate the small companies who are providing the third-party vendors, but it makes the CII service provider responsible for to the regulator for those systems. And what is going to happen in reality is that they're going to now put contractual obligations onto all these companies to tell them, you need to tell me when there's an incident, you need to meet these requirements because I have to meet these requirements. And so effectively, these small businesses or smaller companies will find themselves having to indirectly comply with the cybersecurity law. And as I mentioned, it doesn't matter where they're located. And so I think, we are going to see that sort of trickle-down effect, where there's going to have to be compliance as long as you are part of that system. And I think that is the intention of the law. It's going to be interesting to see how that's going to play out in implementation.
Do you have any feel right now in terms of, where the CIAs are, stopping with this? So I'm assuming, if you're facilitating the office, cleaning the toilets, for example, that's probably not something that's going to be pushed down as much. But I don't, well, that's a question. How far down the supply chain do you think we'll be going and seeing these requests?
That's
compliance?
A good question, great question. And generally, I think we will, we are likely to see CIIs, I think, sort of perhaps go a little further than, just to ensure that they are able to meet the obligations. So it may not be the cleaning companies, but I suspect it will be anyone who's providing a service or a system that has, that is a part of their offering or their operations, because it also affects their own operations. So I do think that we will see quite a broad reach, certainly by the CIIs, because they will want to make sure that they do that. On the other hand, depending on the third-party system involved, if we're talking about large tech companies, I expect there will be some pushback in terms of whether they're prepared to comply with sort of Singapore requirements. They might be prepared to comply with sort of more global requirements so that they don't have to tailor their systems. So I do think there's going to be a little bit of haggling about this when these contracts are going to be negotiated, and the CII's providers are going to have to implement this across all their contracts, and so that's actually quite a lot of work that has to be done.
Yeah. Could make a joke about lawyers, but I'll save that one. It'll be a busy time for you. Brilliant. Okay, and then you mentioned in terms of your overview that quite happily for us in cyber, we've not moved away from difficult acronyms. So the two new categories, or a few new categories that brought in, but two of them that you mentioned, so the system of temporary cybersecurity concern, and then we have the entities of special cybersecurity interest. So can you break down those categories? What does it entail, and why are those really critical for Singapore's security landscape?
Sure. So I guess systems of temporary cybersecurity concern is quite an interesting concept, because here in this situation, the idea is that these systems are only of critical importance during certain time periods or certain events. Excuse me. So, and the example that was actually given by Parliament when they passed this was, for example, the Youth Olympic Games in Singapore. Excuse me, which was held in 2018, or even the visit, the summit between Trump and Kim that was held in Singapore. So if someone was providing security or doing something in relation to that.
It's those time-bound, we've got important people coming into country. They're, sensitive on a global scale, and we need just that extra bit of control over that specific time-bound event. Is that what?
I think so, because I think the idea is that these would not usually be, so you might have a hotel that's hosting very high
Shangri-La Dialogue, for example, just the other week. Yeah.
So that, and then in that situation, they might consider that the hotels, systems, the security systems, because if someone accesses that, they will be able to see, the information about VIPs, and so in that they could potentially designate the hotel, say, systems, and STCC just for the period of, say, the Shangri-La dialogue.
Okay, and in that circumstance, let's keep going with the Shangri-La. So their systems then have to have special compliance, or people are allocated in order to do audits and tests. Do we know how it will work in practice?
So I think so far what the law says is that they would have certain obligations, so they have to furnish information relating to the system.
Mm-hmm.
So they might have to provide information about, this is the system we're using, what are the security protocols that they have, and obviously if there is an incident that occurs in relation to the STCC, then there is a reporting obligation.
Okay, that makes sense. And then what about the entity's special cybersecurity interests?
So this is another interesting one, I think, because it's potentially certain organizations that hold sensitive information and whose operations, if they're disrupted, might have significant detrimental effect on Singapore's defense or national security. And so they may be designated as entities of special cybersecurity interest. And what's interesting about this is that the example provided by the government was actually universities.
Mm.
And so the idea is that some universities do very sensitive research in certain areas, and so they do hold quite a bit of valuable information. I think we've seen that in some other countries, for example, in the US, where universities are targeted. And so potentially these organizations could be designated as ESCIs, in which case then similarly they will have reporting obligations, and also they will have to then ensure that they meet certain requirements. Not as stringent as CIIs and not as stringent as STCCs, but still they have to meet certain requirements. And I think what's also very interesting is that they're not going to announce who is an ESCI, because the idea is if I announce who's an ESCI, then they're immediately going to
target.
Yeah. So we're not going to say who we think are potentially, risky targets. So I think, but obviously the entity will know because they will be designated. But I think for us, for the public, there's not going to be any announcement of who they are.
Yeah. But it's brilliant, and it's really forward-thinking. In cybersecurity, we talk about, making sure there's so much collaboration in order to, fight how sophisticated attacks are coming. And, with these regulations in place, it really supports the confidence we can have, whether you're a corporate looking into universities, whether you're government looking into corporates, it does create that level of trust that I think where collaboration can happen. So. It's exciting. It's not, new rules can be exciting too.
No, I think that's a very good point, because it's true that actually we're looking at a lot of this research is sponsored research and in collaboration with third parties. And as you said, they get their data from many companies, and so I do think that will provide a better foundation for collaboration. And for organizations to want to work with universities. So
yeah.
Absolutely right.
Rules can be fun. So why don't we go down to, in terms of, that regulatory piece? Yeah. So, bigger oversight, you've mentioned about reporting breaches. So why don't you just give us a bit more detail in that space, scare us enough to then motivate us to where we can now look to improve our systems and preparedness.
So just before I jump into that, I'm going to mention one more category, which is the foundational digital infrastructure providers. So the Act actually specifies who these entities are. It's cloud computing services and data center facility services. So anyone who provides these types of services are now going to be regulated under the new law. And so they will have to then comply with certain standards and also ensure that their practices meet the requirements and their reporting requirements. And so I think, again, that sort of increases the standard of all the data centers, data center providers and facilities that are based in Singapore. And so in terms of sort of what this is going to mean and how people are going to comply, I think the first thing is that you have to know whether or not you are regulated, or you might be a third-party systems provider, and you need to know whether you're providing a system to a CII. And so I think the first piece is to understand, are you regulated? Or if you're not, are you going to be indirectly regulated because you are providing a service? And so sort of figuring out where you stand in that regime is the first thing. And then secondly, I think if you are regulated, you have to make sure that you are going to be able to comply with these new obligations. And I think that is one where, I mentioned especially the businesses that are not based in Singapore, who might be surprised to find themselves regulated under, or their systems to be designated, for example. So I think it's important to expect that there are going to be higher compliance requirements, maybe more costs in terms of compliance, but obviously I think in terms of the benefits to how rigorous the cybersecurity landscape is, how protected our data will be, these are all things that are really key fundamentals in order for all these services to continue to be provided and all these infrastructure to continue to work.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite quotes or analogies is the reason brakes were put on cars was actually so cars could accelerate faster. And I feel that so strongly when we think about cyber in terms of, we've got all this technological progress and we can really, really run with some of these things. But unless we've got the right safeguards, then, we're going to spin off the track. So, yeah.
Good point, exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Sheena.
You're most welcome.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google, and other podcast platforms. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word by sharing it across your network. For more information about the Chamber and what we do, visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.